Power is never built overnight and it never collapses quietly. In the streets of New York, in smoke-filled rooms and behind closed doors, a single man learned how to turn chaos into control, rivals into partners, and crime into a system. He studied people, money, and loyalty like a strategist studies a battlefield. For years, his name moved borders, decided fortunes, and reshaped the underworld. But every empire leaves traces. Every network creates pressure. Every alliance carries risk. When investigators closed in, when witnesses spoke, and when courtrooms replaced backrooms, the question was no longer how he rose, but how long he could hold on. At the height of his power, Charles Lucky Luciano was considered the most influential figure in the world of organized crime, a man whose strategic brilliance revolutionized the Mafia and whose very name invoked fear, respect, and admiration. He was not just a criminal, he was a kingpin in the truest sense of the word, an individual who could make or break entire empires. But despite his power, the arrest that shook the Mafia world was as swift as it was brutal. The downfall of a man who had once been untouchable was, in many ways, as dramatic and unexpected as the rise that preceded it. The arrest of Luciano marked a turning point not just in the history of organized crime but in the psyche of the men who lived by the rules of the underworld. The story begins in the early 1930s, a time when Luciano was in the midst of consolidating his power. He had already begun to transform the fragmented, chaotic nature of the Mafia into a highly structured criminal enterprise. Luciano wasn't just a mob boss, he was a visionary who saw the potential for organized crime to be managed like a legitimate business, with hierarchy, loyalty, and, above all, a deep understanding of human nature. He was smart, ruthless, and always one step ahead of everyone around him. But that very sense of control, that belief that he had everything in his grasp, would soon prove to be his undoing. It's hard to overstate just how monumental Luciano's influence was at the time. He controlled a vast network of illegal activities, from bootlegging during Prohibition to gambling, extortion, and narcotics. His reach stretched across the United States and even to other parts of the world, particularly in Europe. He was not just a part of the Mafia, he was the Mafia. But all of that power came at a cost. The underworld was never a place of stability, and even the most powerful figures were constantly vulnerable to betrayal, political maneuvering, and law enforcement. For all his brilliance in organizing crime, Luciano had failed to navigate the most dangerous aspect of his life: his relationships with those closest to him. At this time, Luciano's main rival in New York was Salvatore Maranzano, a powerful Mafia boss who had ambitions of taking over Luciano's territory. The conflict between the two had reached a boiling point, and it seemed only a matter of time before one would destroy the other. It was this deadly rivalry that would ultimately lead to Luciano's downfall, but it was also the way he handled betrayal within his own ranks that would prove to be his fatal flaw. Luciano had built a system of power based on loyalty and trust, but as history would prove, no one was ever completely loyal, and trust in the Mafia was a commodity that could be bought and sold like anything else. In the world of organized crime, loyalty was everything. However, it wasn't just loyalty to the boss, it was loyalty to the code. The Mafia's secretive, often brutal code of silence, omerta, governed the actions of every member. It was a code that demanded respect, feared reprisal, and above all, discouraged betrayal. But Luciano knew that the code, while powerful, was also fragile. People betrayed for many reasons: greed, ambition, or a simple desire for power. Luciano's greatest mistake was to underestimate just how much his closest allies could turn on him when their own survival was on the line. When betrayal came, it came from those he least expected. The spark that lit the fuse leading to Luciano's arrest came in the form of an FBI investigation. Federal authorities had long been after Luciano, but despite years of investigation, they had been unable to build a solid case. They needed a way to take him down legally, and the perfect opportunity came when they discovered a possible connection between Luciano and a wide range of illegal operations, including narcotics trafficking and prostitution. The federal government had long been trying to crack down on organized crime, and with the rise of the Roosevelt administration, the stakes were higher than ever before. Luciano's arrest came in 1936, and it was as much a result of political maneuvering as it was law enforcement diligence. The government, keen to demonstrate its commitment to fighting crime, was eager to take down the most prominent criminal figure in the country. But Luciano's arrest wasn't simply a case of criminal justice. It was a calculated attack on the power structure he had built. It was a symbol of the government's desire to send a message, not just to the Mafia but to the entire criminal world. It was a warning that even the most powerful figures were not immune to the law. But Luciano, ever the strategist, would not go down without a fight. He knew that his empire was too vast, too intricate to fall easily. He had spent years building a network of loyal men, and though some would betray him, others would remain loyal to the bitter end. His legal team was legendary, and for a time, it seemed as though the charges against him would not stick. But the wheels of justice moved slowly, and in 1936, Luciano was convicted on charges of forced prostitution. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The trial was a spectacle, an event that was covered by the press in a way that made Luciano an even bigger figure in the public's eye. In many ways, the trial cemented his status as a modern-day Robin Hood. He was the criminal kingpin whom the government couldn't beat, the man who had evaded justice for years. But as much as Luciano had carefully crafted his public image, he was still a criminal, and the trial ultimately led to his conviction. It was the first major setback in a career filled with calculated victories, and the consequences of that defeat would reverberate through the Mafia for decades to come. As he was carted off to prison, Lucky Luciano's world was shaken to its very core. The man who had once been the architect of an empire was now just another inmate behind bars, his dreams of further expansion dashed. But even from behind those prison walls, Luciano's mind never stopped working. He continued to influence the Mafia from the inside, continuing his empire's operations through a network of loyalists. His ability to maintain control of his organization while incarcerated was a testament to the depth of his power, but it was also a sign that his criminal genius had no bounds. But there was a twist in the story. In 1946, after serving just a fraction of his sentence, Luciano was granted a commutation and deported to Italy. The United States government, eager to rid itself of the foreign criminal, decided that it would be better to exile him than to allow him to continue running his operations from behind bars. For Luciano, it was the ultimate irony. Exiled to a country where he had once been a stranger, he found himself once again grappling with the question of his legacy. He had built an empire, but now, in his final years, he would be forced to watch it slip away, just as quickly as it had been built. Lucky Luciano, the man who had been the puppet master of a criminal empire, was now a shadow of his former self. He had been betrayed, imprisoned, exiled, and stripped of everything he had once controlled. But even in his final years, Luciano's mind remained sharp, and his influence continued to be felt in the criminal underworld. His ability to adapt, to remain relevant even in exile, was a testament to the lasting power of his legacy. The world may have taken everything from him, but it could never take his place in history. He had been the mastermind who had shaped modern organized crime, and despite his fall from grace, he would forever be remembered as one of the most brilliant criminals the world had ever known. The arrest that shocked the Mafia was not just the end of an era, it was the beginning of another. Lucky Luciano may have fallen, but his methods, his ideas, and his empire would continue to influence generations of criminals long after his death. His story is one of rise and fall, of power and betrayal, and of the relentless pursuit of control in a world where even the mightiest can be brought down. Before Lucky Luciano ascended to the pinnacle of power within the criminal underworld, the Mafia was a fragmented, chaotic entity, lacking the unified structure that would later define Luciano's empire. In the years leading up to his rise, organized crime in America was a patchwork of rival factions, each operating under their own rules and in their own territories. The underworld was a place of constant turmoil, where power struggles between different ethnic groups and crime families were the norm rather than the exception. The American Mafia, as it was known, was in disarray with little sense of cohesion, and an atmosphere that was more marked by mistrust and violence than by cooperation or strategy. In New York City, the center of the Mafia universe, the crime families were mostly divided by nationality and ethnic lines. The Sicilian Mafia, which had the most influence in the city, was constantly at odds with the Neapolitan Mafia, while the Jewish, Irish, and Italian-American factions each fought to carve out their own territories. The concept of a unified mafia under one leader seemed almost impossible, and yet Luciano's vision would soon change that. In many ways, the fractured state of organized crime before Luciano's rise was a reflection of the disarray in American society itself. The country was in the grip of prohibition, a time when the sale and distribution of alcohol were illegal, but demand for it was at an all-time high. This provided the perfect breeding ground for criminal organizations, as smuggling and bootlegging became immensely profitable activities. But despite the wealth that prohibition brought, it also brought violent competition and instability, as gangs fought to control the lucrative trade. In the early years of the 20th century, crime was largely a matter of local control. Each family or faction operated independently, with little regard for the larger picture. While there were alliances and occasional truces, these were fragile at best. The Mafia was far from a cohesive organization. It was a loose collection of competing factions that, more often than not, sought to destroy each other than to cooperate. Rivalries between different groups of mobsters were common, and territory was the ultimate prize. Loyalty was often secondary to the desire for power and wealth, and betrayal was a constant threat. The absence of a central figure with the vision and power to bring these disparate elements together made the Mafia vulnerable to internal divisions and external threats. In this climate of disunity and bloodshed, figures like Joe, the boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano dominated the landscape. Masuria, the head of one of the most powerful Mafia families in New York, was a traditionalist. He sought to maintain the old ways of doing business, relying on brute force, intimidation and violence to maintain control. Masuria's power was built on fear, and his dominance seemed unchallenged for a time. However, his approach to leadership was outdated and increasingly ineffective in the face of new challenges, particularly from younger, more ambitious mobsters who had no interest in adhering to the old code of violence and bloodshed. Maranzano, a Sicilian Mafia boss, also rose to prominence during this period, and his ambitions were just as grand. He sought to expand his power by consolidating control over the entire New York Mafia. However, his vision was even more traditional and authoritarian than Masuria's, and his demand for loyalty from his underlings quickly alienated many potential allies. It was within this chaotic environment that Luciano began to make his mark. A young, ambitious man with an innate understanding of how power operated, he recognized that the Mafia needed to evolve in order to survive. Luciano had little patience for the old ways of doing business. He saw that the Mafia's reliance on violence and brute force was not sustainable. Instead, he believed in creating an organization based on intelligence, organization, and collaboration. While Masuria and Maranzano relied on the outdated concept of loyalty through fear, Luciano was determined to build a system where loyalty came from mutual benefit and the understanding that everyone had something to gain from cooperation. His vision was of a Mafia that was structured like a legitimate business, where each faction had a stake in the organization's success, and each player had a role to play. Luciano's intelligence and strategic thinking quickly set him apart from his rivals. He understood that the future of organized crime was not in the hands of the men who clung to the past, but in the hands of those who could adapt to the changing times. By the mid-1920s, Luciano had begun to assemble a group of like-minded individuals, men who shared his vision of a more organized, professional Mafia. Key figures like Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello would eventually become Luciano's trusted allies, forming the foundation of his criminal empire. Together, they would reshape the Mafia into a more efficient and profitable organization. One of Luciano's most revolutionary ideas was the concept of the Commission, an advisory board made up of the heads of the most powerful Mafia families. The Commission was designed to resolve disputes between families, ensuring that conflicts were settled without resorting to open violence. It was a bold move as it required mob bosses to relinquish some of their traditional power and trust in a higher authority. But Luciano understood that the future of organized crime depended on cooperation, and he was willing to take the risks necessary to create a more stable and profitable system. The Commission was not without its challenges, but it ultimately laid the foundation for the Mafia's rise to unprecedented power. Luciano's ability to see the bigger picture, to understand the importance of cooperation and structure, set him apart from other mobsters who were trapped in the old ways of thinking. He recognized that the future of organized crime would not be determined by raw power alone but by the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Prohibition was an ideal example of this. While many of Luciano's contemporaries saw it as an opportunity for quick profits, Luciano saw it as a way to build a lasting legacy. By organizing bootlegging operations efficiently, working with politicians, and ensuring that his organization was well equipped to handle the changing tides of law enforcement, Luciano built an empire that was more resilient and profitable than any of its competitors. The world before Lucky Luciano was one of instability and lawlessness, a world where crime was a constant, but where there was little to no structure or organization. Luciano's rise marked the beginning of a new era in organized crime, one where efficiency, intelligence and strategy were just as important as violence and fear. His ability to bring order to chaos, to see the potential for collaboration where others saw only competition, was a turning point in the history of the Mafia. Luciano's vision would shape the underworld for decades to come, as his organizational genius transformed the Mafia from a chaotic and disjointed collection of crime families into a powerful, cohesive entity with the resources and intelligence to compete on a global scale. The world before Luciano was one of fractured power, but under his leadership, the Mafia would become a well-oiled machine, a force to be reckoned with. Born in the seedy streets of the Lower East Side of New York, Charles Lucky Luciano's rise from an impoverished immigrant background to become the most powerful figure in organized crime is a story shaped by ambition, cunning, and survival. The early years of his life were a far cry from the lavish lifestyle he would eventually enjoy. As the son of poor Italian immigrants, Luciano was raised in a neighborhood teeming with poverty, crime, and hardship. His family, like so many others in that era, struggled to make ends meet, with little opportunity for upward mobility. The streets, however, offered something else, a harsh but clear path to power. Luciano's early exposure to crime came not from choice but from necessity. The Lower East Side was a hotbed for petty criminals and small-time hustlers, a place where survival often meant getting involved in illegal activities. From a young age, Luciano was no stranger to the brutal realities of street life. By the time he was a teenager, he had already worked his way into the criminal underworld, running errands for older, more experienced mobsters and learning the ropes of small-time hustles. His early experiences on the streets taught him two things. First, that the world was unforgiving, and second, that power was the only way to protect oneself. Unlike many of the young men around him, Luciano wasn't content with petty crime. He had bigger ambitions, and he knew that the path to success would require more than just street smarts. It would require vision and strategy. Luciano's initial foray into organized crime was marked by a series of small-time jobs that quickly escalated into bigger opportunities. His entry into the Mafia proper came through his association with various small-time criminal groups operating in the Lower East Side. It wasn't long before he caught the attention of more influential figures within the Mafia. One of the key turning points in Luciano's early career was his partnership with a man named Arnold Rothstein, a notorious gambler and racketeer who would become one of the most influential figures in the world of organized crime. Rothstein was a highly intelligent man who saw the potential in Luciano and took him under his wing. It was through Rothstein that Luciano began to learn the intricacies of organized crime, including the mechanics of betting, the importance of corruption, and the power of influence in high places. Under Rothstein's tutelage, Luciano quickly began to refine his criminal enterprise, learning not just the basics of crime, but also how to build a network of allies, protect his interests, and outmaneuver his rivals. While Rothstein was an important figure in Luciano's life, it was also during this time that Luciano began to develop his own vision for what the Mafia could become. He didn't just want to be a cog in someone else's machine. He wanted to build his own empire, and he had the ambition and the intellect to do so. Luciano understood that the Mafia needed to evolve, to grow from a collection of small-time thugs into a highly organized and efficient criminal enterprise. His early years were marked by his growing understanding that the key to real power was not in violence alone, but in control. Control over people, control over the territory, and control over the money. But even as Luciano's influence began to grow, he faced significant obstacles. The Mafia, like many organizations, was rife with internal strife and power struggles. The old guard, which still adhered to traditional methods of crime, was resistant to change. Figures like Joe Masuria, a powerful boss of the Genovese family, represented the old way of doing business. Masuria's methods were rooted in violence, fear, and intimidation, relying on brute force to maintain control. Luciano, on the other hand, was looking toward the future, toward a more systematic corporate approach to crime. This difference in vision would ultimately set the stage for a brutal power struggle that would define the coming years of Luciano's rise. Luciano's ability to navigate this treacherous world of Mafia politics was one of his greatest assets. While many of his contemporaries were bogged down by petty rivalries and outdated methods of operation, Luciano's mind was focused on the bigger picture. He saw the potential for a new kind of Mafia, one that was professional, organized, and capable of adapting to the changing landscape of crime. In many ways, Luciano's early rise can be attributed to his ability to identify opportunities where others saw only obstacles. His partnerships, particularly with men like Meyer Lansky, a brilliant Jewish mobster, helped Luciano expand his influence and resources. Lansky, with his sharp mind for business and finance, became one of Luciano's most trusted allies. Together, they formed a powerful alliance that would eventually become the backbone of Luciano's empire. One of the most significant moments in Luciano's early career came with his decision to turn on Masuria. In a move that would shake the foundations of the Mafia, Luciano made the bold decision to betray his former mentor and ally. This act of treachery was not one taken lightly, but Luciano understood that to truly control the Mafia, he would need to eliminate any obstacles in his path. Masuria, for all his power, had become a liability. His methods were too archaic, his control too authoritarian. Luciano, on the other hand, had a vision of a more modern, efficient, and profitable criminal enterprise. With his growing network of allies, including Lansky and others, Luciano orchestrated Masuria's murder in 1931, a turning point that marked the beginning of his absolute control over New York's criminal scene. The assassination of Masuria was not just a personal victory for Luciano, it was a statement to the entire underworld. It was the moment when Luciano declared his vision for the future of organized crime. It was also a pivotal moment in the larger struggle between the old guard of mafia bosses and the new generation of crime lords who were willing to challenge the status quo. By killing Masuria, Luciano demonstrated that he was not just another thug seeking power. He was a leader, a visionary who could take the mafia into a new era. The murder itself was a carefully calculated move, executed with precision and efficiency, much like the way Luciano would later run his entire criminal empire. But even as Luciano's power grew, he still faced one significant rival, Salvatore Maranzano. A Sicilian-born boss, Maranzano had his own ambitions of taking control of the New York Mafia. He sought to solidify his power by declaring himself the Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses, a title that would make him the supreme ruler of the Mafia in America. Maranzano's ambition threatened to undo everything Luciano had worked for. In response, Luciano quickly began to make his move. He struck a deal with the Jewish gangster Arnold Rothstein's associates, as well as other influential figures, to orchestrate Maranzano's downfall. The result was another carefully executed murder. This time, it was Maranzano who would meet a violent end. By the time Luciano had dealt with both Masuria and Maranzano, the landscape of the Mafia had changed forever. Luciano had eliminated the old guard and had consolidated his power in a way that no one had ever seen before. He had secured his position at the top of the criminal world, and now he could begin to implement his vision for a new kind of organized crime. Luciano's rise was not just about power for the sake of power, it was about creating something more sophisticated, more enduring, and ultimately more profitable. His early years, marked by crime, betrayal, and strategic alliances, were the foundation of what would become one of the most powerful and enduring criminal empires in history. Through intelligence, ambition, and an unrelenting will to succeed, Luciano had begun the process of reshaping the Mafia in his own image. Luciano's vision for the Mafia was nothing short of revolutionary. His insight into the future of organized crime was shaped by a deep understanding of how to manage resources, minimize risk, and maximize profit. In an era dominated by violent, often chaotic mobsters, Luciano saw the potential to turn crime into a legitimate, structured business. His genius lay not just in his ability to lead, but in his strategic mind that was capable of transforming disorganized crime into a sophisticated network with clear divisions of labor, responsibilities, and expectations. Where his predecessors relied on brute force and fear, Luciano's innovation was in organizing the Mafia like a corporation, making it more adaptable, profitable, and, most importantly, durable. One of the key ways Luciano built his empire was through the creation of a business model that included various factions working together rather than against each other. Instead of allowing the Mafia to remain a loose collection of independent families, he laid the groundwork for a more structured organization. The most critical element of this shift was the creation of the Commission, a council of the most powerful Mafia bosses who would come together to settle disputes, allocate territories, and ensure that the organization operated as a unified front. The Commission was a direct challenge to the chaotic, individualistic structure that had previously dominated the Mafia. By formalizing these interactions, Luciano ensured that his empire would be better able to withstand internal conflict and competition from outside forces. The Commission not only helped maintain peace within the organization, but it also gave Luciano the means to control and regulate the flow of money, power, and influence among the families. Under his leadership, the Mafia became a well-oiled machine, its various parts working together for mutual gain rather than constant bickering and territorial squabbles. Luciano's other key innovation was his ability to bring new players into the fold, forging relationships with individuals and groups who had never before been involved in the Mafia. One of his most important alliances was with Meyer Lansky, a brilliant Jewish gangster who had an exceptional mind for finance and business. While the Italian Mafia had long been the dominant force in New York, Luciano recognized the growing power of Jewish crime families, particularly those with connections to legitimate businesses. Lansky's expertise in money laundering, gambling, and finance would prove invaluable to Luciano's empire. It was Lansky who helped create the financial infrastructure that allowed Luciano to launder money through legitimate businesses, ensuring that his criminal enterprises remained untouchable by law enforcement. In addition to Lansky, Luciano worked closely with figures like Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel, who was instrumental in running the West Coast operations, particularly in Las Vegas. Luciano had long understood that the future of organized crime wasn't just in New York, but in the development of nationwide networks. He recognized the potential of Las Vegas, a city that was just beginning to develop as a gambling mecca, and made sure that his empire had a foothold there. Siegel's involvement in the development of the Flamingo Hotel would become legendary, but it was Luciano's foresight that laid the foundation for what would eventually become the modern-day Las Vegas gambling empire. Another key aspect of Luciano's rise to power was his ability to expand beyond the traditional mafia activities of bootlegging and gambling. He quickly realized that there were vast profits to be made in the labor unions, particularly in the shipping and dockworker industries. The waterfront was a critical piece of the economic infrastructure in New York, and by securing influence over the unions, Luciano could control the flow of goods, manipulate wages, and demand a cut from any activity that took place on the docks. This gave him leverage over the entire city, as the waterfront was vital to trade and commerce. In addition to controlling the docks, Luciano expanded his operations into other sectors, including narcotics trafficking, which was rapidly growing in prominence during the 1930s. Luciano's ability to adapt to changing markets and exploit new opportunities was another reason for his success. When Prohibition ended in 1933, many gangsters who had made their fortunes on bootlegging struggled to adjust to the new legal landscape. Luciano, however, recognized that the end of Prohibition didn't mean the end of organized crime. It just meant that the focus would shift. Rather than being dependent on alcohol, he diversified into new, more lucrative areas. The Mafia's reach expanded into legitimate businesses like restaurants, construction, and even real estate. These legitimate businesses allowed Luciano to hide his criminal activities behind a facade of respectability, making it harder for law enforcement to trace illicit earnings. His empire wasn't just built on smuggling and illegal gambling, it was a sprawling network that encompassed both illegal and legal businesses, each serving the broader goal of generating wealth and influence. Luciano's control over the Mafia wasn't limited to his organizational innovations. He also understood the psychology of the men who worked for him. Unlike his predecessors who ruled through fear and violence, Luciano knew that loyalty was not something that could be imposed through intimidation alone. He had a far more pragmatic approach. Loyalty, in his view, was best maintained through mutual benefit. He built relationships with other Mafia bosses not through the threat of violence, but through partnership. He offered men opportunities to expand their businesses and grow their wealth, and in return he demanded their loyalty. His philosophy was simple: as long as everyone was making money, there was no reason to betray one another. This was a stark contrast to the older, more traditional mobsters who ruled through fear and the constant threat of violence. This shift in approach was critical in Luciano's ability to create a stable criminal empire. The men who worked for him saw tangible benefits from their loyalty, which meant they were less likely to turn on him. He created a culture of trust and cooperation, even among the cutthroat world of organized crime. This was revolutionary for the time, and it laid the foundation for a system that would survive for decades. While violence and intimidation were still tools in Luciano's arsenal, they were used sparingly and strategically. He understood that violence was a necessary evil, but it was also something that could ultimately undermine his carefully constructed empire if used too recklessly. Furthermore, Luciano's ability to operate on both sides of the law allowed him to expand his influence across the country. He forged connections with politicians, law enforcement officials, and businessmen, using bribery, corruption, and blackmail to secure protection for his operations. His alliances with key figures in the political and business worlds helped ensure that his criminal activities went largely unchecked. He made sure that his operations were covered by political influence, which allowed him to continue his business without fear of serious legal consequences. This close relationship with politicians and law enforcement ensured that Luciano had a network of protection that made it exceedingly difficult for his rivals or the government to take him down. By the time Luciano had solidified his power, his criminal empire was a sprawling network of operations, businesses, and alliances that stretched across the country and beyond. His reach extended into nearly every major city, and he was involved in everything from gambling and narcotics to labor unions and international smuggling. He had successfully redefined the Mafia, transforming it from a collection of disjointed criminal families into a unified and highly organized business. But what truly set Luciano apart from the rest of his contemporaries was his ability to manage this sprawling empire with remarkable efficiency. His methods were systematic, his decisions calculated, and his approach to business was as methodical as any Fortune 500 CEO. As Luciano's power continued to grow, so did his influence. He became a key figure in the world of organized crime, not just in New York but across the United States. His ability to forge alliances, maintain loyalty, and adapt to changing circumstances made him an extraordinarily effective leader. His empire was not built on the shaky foundations of violence and fear. It was constructed with intelligence, strategy, and a deep understanding of the mechanics of power. By transforming the Mafia into a more structured, professional enterprise, Luciano ensured that his influence would endure long after his reign. In the shadowy world of organized crime, where fear and loyalty intertwine to create a fragile balance of power, the Mafia's code of silence, omerta, was more than just a rule. It was the very foundation on which the entire system of organized crime stood. This unspoken code dictated that silence was paramount, and betrayal the ultimate sin. For men like Lucky Luciano who sought to modernize and stabilize the Mafia, omerta was both a tool and a weapon. It was the glue that held his empire together, ensuring that his subordinates, allies, and even rivals adhered to the unspoken rule that secrets were sacred, and loyalty was not negotiable. Yet, beneath this strict adherence to silence, omerta also served as a psychological contract, manipulating fear, trust, and power in ways that would shape Luciano's entire criminal career. The concept of omerta was deeply rooted in the traditions of southern Italy, where the Mafia was born. In its simplest form, it was the idea that members of the Mafia should never cooperate with law enforcement, government authorities, or outsiders. Those who broke this sacred rule were met with a brutal punishment, death or worse. It wasn't just about not talking. It was about the idea of protecting the organization at all costs, no matter the personal sacrifice. For men like Luciano, omerta was the essential mechanism that allowed the Mafia to function like a well-oiled machine. If one member betrayed the group, it would jeopardize everything: the business, the operations, and the trust within the ranks. Silence wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. But omerta was more than just an effective tool for protecting the organization from outside threats. It was also a psychological weapon that played on the fear and loyalty of those within the Mafia. Luciano understood that the code was powerful because it created a kind of psychological dependency on the Mafia for its members. Loyalty to the group wasn't just a matter of business, it became an existential necessity. Betrayal of the code meant not just loss of power but the loss of everything: life, respect, status, and the network of allies. This sense of personal threat was, in many ways, the driving force behind the Mafia's ability to enforce loyalty. For Luciano, loyalty wasn't merely a matter of fear. It was also an investment. Those who were loyal to him didn't just risk their lives for the organization. They also stood to gain wealth, protection, and a sense of purpose. The arrangement was symbiotic. In exchange for loyalty, Luciano offered his men an opportunity to rise in the ranks, to acquire wealth through illegal means, and to benefit from the protection that came with being a part of his empire. The code of silence, then, was a fundamental part of this transaction. As long as everyone followed the code, everyone thrived. But when one person broke the code, they threatened the entire structure. Betrayal, therefore, was not just a personal betrayal. It was a betrayal of the entire network that had been built on trust and mutual benefit. The psychological contract of omerta extended far beyond loyalty and fear. It also relied on respect. For Luciano, respect was not just something to be demanded, it had to be earned. He wasn't like the old bosses who relied solely on brute force and intimidation to command respect. Luciano understood that respect could be secured through intelligence, fairness, and the ability to navigate complex relationships. In many ways, his strategy of business first helped him win respect not only from his underlings but from his rivals as well. His reputation as a businessman who could be trusted to uphold his agreements was just as crucial as his ability to enforce discipline through violence when necessary. At the same time, Luciano knew that the Mafia was not a one-man show. Omerta applied to everyone, and everyone had a role to play in maintaining the integrity of the organization. This sense of collective responsibility was central to Luciano's vision of the Mafia as a well-organized business. He didn't just want men to fear him, he wanted them to feel invested in the system. His ability to enforce omerta through mutual benefit and shared success was a reflection of his strategic mindset. He didn't rely on fear alone to maintain order. He also relied on loyalty born from shared interest. This balance was crucial to maintaining the Mafia's unity during its most turbulent years. However, while omerta was an essential tool for the Mafia's survival, it also had a darker side. It made the Mafia a closed society, one that was not only impervious to outsiders but also difficult for those within it to escape. The loyalty that was demanded of members was so absolute that it created a kind of moral cage. Men who were once willing to betray others for personal gain often found themselves trapped by the same code of silence that they had used to build their power. The price of silence was often too high, and the fear of betrayal grew as the stakes increased. For some, this constant pressure to conform and stay loyal led to paranoia, guilt, and a constant gnawing fear of what might happen if they stepped out of line. Those who were tempted to break the code often found that the punishment for doing so was not just death, it was a complete erasure from the world they knew. The psychological burden of omerta could weigh heavily on the men who followed it. Many who lived by the code were forced to constantly monitor their behavior, aware that one slip-up could mean their death. While the code offered protection, it also imprisoned those who followed it, ensuring that they remained loyal not out of a genuine desire but because of the ever-present fear of retaliation. This fear, however, also worked to Luciano's advantage. He understood that the constant threat of death, while severe, also kept men in line. The Mafia wasn't just an organization, it was a system of control, a network of fear and loyalty that was as much psychological as it was physical. But Luciano wasn't just a figure who enforced the code through fear, he also understood the strategic use of it in broader operations. The code of silence allowed him to build alliances with other criminal factions, including Jewish, Irish, and even non-mafia groups, without fear of these alliances falling apart due to leaks or betrayal. This was particularly important in the world of organized crime, where shifting allegiances could destabilize entire operations. Luciano's ability to maintain a sense of discipline within his ranks allowed him to create a network of operations that stretched across cities and even countries, knowing that the secrecy of his dealings would be protected by the unwavering loyalty of his men. Furthermore, the code of silence wasn't just a way to protect Luciano from internal rebellion, it was also a shield against the government. The less information that law enforcement could gather, the more secure Luciano's operations were. The more cohesive the Mafia was, the less likely the authorities could infiltrate it. The ability to keep the organization intact through a strict code of silence made it harder for anyone, from the police to rival gangs, to penetrate or destroy Luciano's empire. This made omerta not only a matter of personal survival but also a strategic defense against both law enforcement and competitors. The code's power was as much in its secrecy as in the threat of violence that accompanied it. However, the true power of omerta was in its dual nature, both protective and destructive. While it protected the organization from external threats, it also bound its members in a web of dependency, ensuring that they remained loyal not just for the rewards but for fear of the consequences of breaking the code. As the years went on and Luciano's influence grew, the tension between loyalty and fear became increasingly apparent. His reign was defined by this paradox. While he built an empire based on mutual respect and shared profit, he also ruled through the constant threat of violence for those who dared to betray him. In the end, it was this delicate balance of power, loyalty, and fear that allowed Luciano's criminal empire to thrive, until the very forces he had so carefully nurtured ultimately became the ones that would lead to his downfall. Omerta, the code of silence, was not just the backbone of Luciano's Mafia, it was the force that sustained it, shaped it, and ultimately bound its members to an unbreakable psychological contract. It was the foundation on which Luciano built his empire, and it was the mechanism that allowed him to control a vast criminal network that spanned continents. Yet, in its unwavering demand for loyalty, omerta also carried with it a darkness, an oppressive weight that, over time, would become difficult to bear for many of those who adhered to it. Luciano's transformation of organized crime wasn't just about power or dominance. It was about creating a system that could adapt to the rapidly changing world around him. The business of crime, as Luciano envisioned it, was not only about illegal ventures such as bootlegging, gambling, or extortion. It was about taking those activities and molding them into a sophisticated, highly profitable network that could withstand the pressures of law enforcement, competition, and the ever-evolving landscape of the American economy. Luciano understood that to truly control the criminal underworld, he needed to elevate the Mafia beyond street-level rackets and create a structure that was sustainable and profitable, much like a legitimate business. His ability to see crime as a business enterprise, rather than just a series of violent acts, became one of the cornerstones of his legacy. One of the first moves Luciano made was to recognize that the criminal activities of the Mafia weren't isolated. They were interconnected. Gambling, labor rackets, alcohol, narcotics, and later even prostitution were all linked by a network of suppliers, distributors, and enforcers. Luciano understood that in order to maximize profits and minimize conflict, He needed to centralize control over these industries and create a system of cooperation between the various factions. The traditional mafia structure, where each family operated independently within its own territory, was inefficient and prone to conflict. Luciano realized that, just like a corporation, the mafia needed a central command that could coordinate activities, resolve disputes, and ensure that profits were maximized. The way Luciano applied business principles to the mafia was nothing short of revolutionary. Under his leadership, the mafia was organized into a structure that mirrored the hierarchy of a corporation, with clear divisions of responsibility and oversight. This was a sharp departure from the traditional, chaotic system of mafia rule, which was often governed by personal feuds, vendettas, and a deeply ingrained reliance on violence to resolve disputes. Luciano's idea was to build an organization that was more sustainable and less prone to internal turmoil. He understood that an organization driven by fear and violence would ultimately implode under the weight of its own instability. Instead, he sought to build a system where everyone, from the lowest soldier to the highest boss, understood their role and the benefits that came with adhering to the rules of the organization. One of Luciano's major contributions to the business of crime was his ability to turn rackets into highly organized, profitable enterprises. Instead of relying solely on extortion or street-level operations, he expanded into industries that were more lucrative and less prone to constant surveillance or police intervention. Prohibition, which had fueled the mafia's rise to power during the 1920s, was a perfect example of how Luciano took advantage of the shifting tides of the American economy. While many other criminals were still fixated on bootlegging alcohol, Luciano looked beyond it. He saw that the end of Prohibition would create new opportunities for crime syndicates, and he moved quickly to capitalize on these opportunities. One of the most profitable and enduring aspects of Luciano's empire was his control over the narcotics trade. At a time when the American government was just beginning to crack down on illegal drugs, Luciano saw the potential in this emerging market. He realized that while alcohol had been the focus of Prohibition, the future of organized crime lay in narcotics, particularly heroin. By leveraging his international connections, Luciano was able to establish a profitable narcotics network that spanned the globe, with distribution routes running from Italy to the United States and beyond. This was a game-changing move, as it allowed Luciano to tap into a virtually unlimited market while also diversifying his income streams. The narcotics trade, more than any other venture, provided the steady stream of revenue that kept Luciano's empire intact during periods of upheaval. In addition to narcotics, Luciano also expanded into labor racketeering. While many mafia families had already been involved in union-related activities, Luciano saw this as a crucial area for expansion. Labor unions, particularly those in the construction, shipping, and transportation industries, were rife with corruption and inefficiency. Luciano was quick to seize on this opportunity, using his network of influence to infiltrate and control key unions. By doing so, he was able to extort money from companies in exchange for protection from strikes, labor disruptions, and other obstacles that could harm their businesses. This not only increased Luciano's income but also gave him political leverage, as union leaders were often able to influence local elections and policies. The control of labor unions became a crucial part of Luciano's long-term strategy to cement his influence across various sectors of the economy. Luciano's approach to the business of crime was about long-term planning and diversification. He understood that the most successful criminal empires were those that could weather the storms of law enforcement crackdowns and shifting public sentiment. To do this, he diversified his criminal operations into a wide array of industries that were both legal and illegal, each supporting and reinforcing the others. By controlling various sectors of the economy, Luciano was able to ensure that even if one racket faced increased scrutiny from authorities, others could pick up the slack. This strategic foresight allowed him to continue expanding his empire even when others in the mafia struggled to adapt to the changing times. Perhaps one of the most innovative aspects of Luciano's empire was his relationship with legitimate businesses. While most mafia figures saw legitimate businesses as nothing more than a means of laundering money, Luciano understood that he could use these businesses as cover for his illegal operations. Rather than simply hiding his profits, Luciano found ways to integrate his criminal enterprises with legitimate industries. He used restaurants, nightclubs, casinos, and even shipping companies as fronts for his illicit activities. This strategy not only protected his operations from law enforcement but also provided him with an ongoing stream of revenue from both legal and illegal sources. By intertwining his criminal empire with the broader economy, Luciano was able to insulate himself from the kinds of crackdowns that had derailed other organized crime figures. At the heart of Luciano's business of crime was the recognition that power came from control, not just over people but over systems. His success was due in large part to his ability to create a system of interconnected businesses and operations that function like a corporation. Each part of his empire was designed to work together, from the narcotics trade to the labor unions to the casinos. But his genius lay not only in how he structured these businesses, it was in his ability to maintain flexibility. While he had a clear plan for the future, Luciano also understood that in the world of organized crime, circumstances could change rapidly. His empire needed to be agile, capable of shifting when necessary to take advantage of new opportunities or counteract threats. The ability to adapt to changing circumstances was one of the reasons Luciano's criminal empire endured far longer than many of his contemporaries. Luciano's strategic thinking extended beyond just the financial aspects of his empire. He also understood the importance of managing relationships and maintaining alliances. He knew that the Mafia was not just about profit, it was about managing people and personalities. Luciano's network of alliances, from his key lieutenants like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello to his broader relationships with other criminal organizations, allowed him to create a stable base of power. In many ways, the success of his empire was rooted not just in his ability to make money, but in his ability to manage the human element of his business. By ensuring that key players had a stake in the system and shared in its profits, he was able to create a loyal and efficient workforce that helped him maintain control over his vast network. In conclusion, Luciano's approach to the business of crime was far more than just a series of profitable rackets. It was an organized, strategic, and highly efficient system that enabled him to dominate the criminal underworld. His ability to adapt to changing times, diversify his operations, and integrate both legal and illegal businesses made him one of the most successful criminal masterminds in history. By viewing the Mafia not just as a criminal enterprise but as a multifaceted business, Luciano was able to build an empire that would endure for decades, reshaping the entire structure of organized crime in America. His legacy, built on the principles of organization, adaptability, and control, would continue to influence criminal enterprises long after his reign. As Luciano's power expanded, so did the number of people who sought to undermine or challenge his growing influence. The world of organized crime is one where betrayal is always a looming threat, and those who rise to the top must be prepared to navigate the treacherous waters of alliances, rivalries, and backstabbing. Luciano was no stranger to this harsh reality. While he had successfully consolidated power by eliminating rivals and securing key alliances, the underworld was still rife with those who desired control or harbored resentment. In many ways, Luciano's reign was defined by a series of internal conflicts and betrayals that constantly tested his leadership. But it was his ability to manage these challenges, often turning potential threats into opportunities, that ultimately solidified his position as one of the most formidable figures in organized crime history. The early 1930s were a period of intense volatility in the Mafia. While Luciano had already executed his most significant power play, eliminating Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, the two biggest bosses in New York, his rise to power didn't mean that his control was uncontested. In fact, the very methods that allowed him to seize power also created enemies who sought to either replace him or challenge his authority. Luciano was well aware that the Mafia was not a place for trust. It was a business governed by the whims of power and the constant threat of betrayal. One of the most significant power struggles during this period was the rivalry between Luciano and a man named Frank Costello. While Costello would eventually become one of Luciano's most trusted allies and a key figure in his organization, their relationship didn't start as a smooth partnership. In fact, there was a time when Costello posed a serious threat to Luciano's leadership. Born in Italy, Costello had been one of the key figures who helped Luciano secure his power during the Masuria and Maranzano wars, but as Luciano grew in prominence, Costello began to view himself as the natural successor to Luciano's throne. Costello, a man with a sharp mind and a strong desire for power, felt that Luciano's control was increasingly fragile, and he began to strategize on how to take over the position of boss of bosses. Costello's ambitions were dangerous not just because of his own desire for power but because of his influence among key members of Luciano's organization. The tension between them became palpable as Costello began to work behind the scenes, quietly gaining the support of powerful figures who were disillusioned with Luciano's leadership style. In particular, Costello's control over the lucrative casino operations in Las Vegas gave him leverage over the Mafia's financial interests. This was a pivotal moment in Luciano's reign, as the relationship between the two men grew strained. However, unlike many mafia leaders who would have responded with swift violence, Luciano adopted a more pragmatic approach. He recognized that Frank Costello was too valuable an asset to simply dispose of. Instead, he bided his time and sought to outmaneuver Costello politically, securing his position without the need for an all-out war. But the situation with Costello was just one example of the kind of internal strife that Luciano had to navigate throughout his career. Another major conflict arose within the Commission, the governing body that Luciano had established to regulate the various mafia families and ensure that conflicts were settled without resorting to open warfare. While the Commission was initially designed to create unity among the mafia families, it was also a powder keg of ambition, jealousy, and personal rivalries. Luciano's success in establishing the Commission was undeniably one of his most brilliant moves, but it also meant that the power dynamics within the mafia were more complex than ever before. The balance between collaboration and competition was constantly shifting, and each new alliance or betrayal added another layer of tension to the already volatile mix. One of the key moments in this internal power struggle was the so-called Appalachian Meeting in 1957. This was supposed to be a gathering of the country's most influential mafia bosses, a chance to discuss business, share information, and iron out conflicts. Instead, it turned into a disaster. The meeting, which was held in upstate New York, was raided by the police who had been tipped off about the event. As the police descended upon the gathering, many of the most powerful men in the mafia were arrested, including Luciano's former allies. The raid exposed the vulnerability of the mafia to law enforcement and revealed just how much the underworld had become dependent on the personal relationships between its leaders. The Appalachian Meeting was a major blow to the mafia's stability and a stark reminder of the constant threat of betrayal and exposure. Despite the embarrassment, Luciano's ability to weather the storm and maintain control over his operations was a testament to his resilience. However, the most significant betrayal in Luciano's life came from within his own ranks. For all his careful maneuvering and strategic alliances, Luciano's empire was ultimately destabilized by the very same forces that had helped him rise to power: loyalty and trust. One of Luciano's closest and most trusted allies was a man named Vito Genovese, who had been instrumental in helping Luciano consolidate power during the early days of his reign. Genovese, a powerful figure in his own right, had risen through the ranks of the mafia and had become one of Luciano's top lieutenants. However, as Luciano's influence grew, so did Genovese's ambitions. Genovese, like Costello, saw an opportunity to take control of Luciano's empire. Over time, he began to distance himself from Luciano, secretly building his own network of supporters within the mafia. Genovese's betrayal came when he attempted to orchestrate a coup against Luciano. He saw Luciano's growing power as a threat to his own ambitions and began to plot against him. In a dramatic turn of events, Genovese attempted to have Luciano eliminated. However, Luciano, ever the strategist, was able to survive the assassination attempt. Though wounded, he managed to recover and consolidate his position once again. This attempt on his life was a turning point for Luciano, as it exposed just how fragile his control over the mafia really was. Despite the loyalty he had cultivated over the years, there were still men within his inner circle who were willing to betray him for power. The betrayal by Genovese marked a shift in Luciano's approach to his leadership. He had always been a pragmatic leader, willing to use violence and betrayal when necessary, but the failed assassination attempt made him more cautious and distrustful. It also prompted him to tighten his grip on the mafia's operations, ensuring that any future betrayals would be met with swift and decisive action. Luciano's reign became more a matter of survival than ever before. He was forced to deal with the psychological toll of knowing that even those closest to him were capable of treachery. Despite these betrayals, Luciano's empire remained remarkably resilient. His ability to navigate the web of loyalty and betrayal, and to maintain control even in the face of internal conflict, was one of the key reasons for his success. He understood that power was not just about brute force, it was about understanding human nature and manipulating it to his advantage. He played the game of mafia politics with a level of cunning and foresight that few could match. Luciano's success in overcoming these internal challenges allowed him to remain a dominant force in the world of organized crime, even as other factions sought to tear him down. The betrayals, while painful, only served to reinforce the fundamental truth of the mafia. Loyalty is both the greatest strength and the greatest vulnerability of any criminal empire. In the end, Luciano's ability to survive the betrayals of his closest allies and maintain control over his empire cemented his legacy as one of the most brilliant and resilient figures in mafia history. His story is a testament to the brutal realities of power, loyalty, and betrayal in the world of organized crime, where the line between friend and foe is often razor-thin, and survival depends on one's ability to navigate the shifting tides of loyalty and ambition. Luciano's empire was not immune to the turbulence that always loomed over the Mafia. The world of organized crime is one built on constant friction, between rival factions, between law enforcement and criminals, and even within the criminal organizations themselves. The Mafia was always on the defensive, constantly fighting to protect its turf, its operations, and most importantly, its ability to continue operating in the shadows. The pressures Luciano faced came not only from the increasing scrutiny of law enforcement but also from rival gangs, old enemies, and even from within his own ranks. As his empire expanded, so did the forces that sought to bring it down. Luciano's ability to navigate through these turbulent times, facing both external and internal threats, would ultimately define his legacy. Luciano's reign coincided with a period in history where the criminal underworld was under unprecedented pressure from law enforcement. The 1930s and 1940s saw a significant increase in the resources dedicated to fighting organized crime, particularly through the formation of specialized units within the FBI and local police forces. As federal agents and prosecutors began to focus more on targeting major crime syndicates, the Mafia's activities became harder to conceal. The government's crackdown on organized crime during this period was not just a passing wave but a growing tide that would eventually sweep over the Mafia, forcing it into a corner. Luciano's empire, built on secrecy and protection from the law, was suddenly facing one of its greatest challenges. The early 1930s had been a period of relative stability for Luciano, but the winds of change began to blow more forcefully as law enforcement grew more adept at infiltrating the Mafia. The government's attention on criminal organizations like Luciano's led to a series of high-profile investigations and indictments. It wasn't just that law enforcement had grown more aggressive, it was that the Mafia itself had become too powerful to ignore. Luciano's operations, sprawling across multiple industries and countries, were now too big and too visible. His success had made him a prime target for the authorities, and the walls began to close in on him. One of the most significant external threats to Luciano came in the form of federal law enforcement's increased efforts to charge organized crime figures under the RICO Act, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a tool that would become one of the government's most powerful weapons against the Mafia in the decades to come. In the 1930s, however, the main weapon the government wielded was the National Prohibition Act, better known as the Volstead Act, which had been designed to prohibit the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. Prohibition had allowed the Mafia to flourish, but it was also its undoing. When the government ended Prohibition in 1933, it left the Mafia scrambling to find new ways to maintain its dominance in the underworld. But even as the Mafia adapted and shifted to new rackets, the government's focus on organized crime remained unwavering. The pressures mounted further when Luciano's association with his powerful partners, like Meyer Lansky and the Jewish syndicates, became more scrutinized. These alliances, which had been instrumental in the creation of his empire, were now under fire. The government understood that the Mafia was not just an Italian problem, it was a network of criminal organizations that had established a powerful grip on many aspects of American life. In Luciano's case, his ties to global criminal syndicates, particularly in Europe, made him an even more prominent target. He was no longer just a figure in New York City's underworld. His empire reached international boundaries, and with that came heightened attention from law enforcement agencies across the globe. As federal law enforcement targeted Luciano, it also had to contend with the more immediate threats posed by rival criminal factions. Luciano's success, while bringing him incredible wealth and power, had also created a series of enemies, both within the Mafia and outside of it. Rival gangsters, whose interests clashed with Luciano's business operations, sought to undermine him. One of the most notable rivals was Vito Genovese, a powerful Mafia figure who had once been Luciano's close ally. As Luciano's empire expanded, so did the aspirations of Genovese. His desire to take over the position of boss was clear, and he would eventually attempt to overthrow Luciano's leadership. Genovese's betrayal, which we will discuss in greater detail in later sections, was not just a personal vendetta, it was a matter of business. Genovese sought to control Luciano's vast operations, particularly his gambling empire, which was the linchpin of Luciano's criminal network. While Luciano dealt with the external pressures of law enforcement and rival gangs, he also had to navigate the shifting dynamics within his own ranks. The very system he had built, an empire of mutual benefit and collaboration, was beginning to show cracks. Power struggles, even among his closest allies, threatened to destabilize his organization. There were whispers of betrayal, and even those who had been loyal to Luciano from the beginning began to show signs of discontent. The question that haunted Luciano during these years was whether his empire, so carefully constructed and maintained, would survive the growing external and internal pressures. But even as his enemies closed in, Luciano demonstrated his remarkable ability to adapt and survive. One of his greatest strengths was his resilience, his ability to turn challenges into opportunities. When law enforcement began to focus more intensely on organized crime, Luciano understood that he needed to change his tactics. Instead of directly confronting law enforcement, he sought to protect his operations by working within the system. His connections with politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement officers were invaluable in this period. Luciano had spent years cultivating relationships with key figures in both the political and business worlds, and these connections would prove crucial as he navigated the growing pressure from the authorities. In addition to his political connections, Luciano's ability to maintain a strong international network helped shield his empire from the full force of law enforcement. His ties to European crime syndicates, particularly those in Italy, helped him continue his operations even as law enforcement in the U.S. ramped up their efforts. Luciano knew that the key to surviving the government's increasing scrutiny was to keep a low profile while maintaining his international connections. He was a master at working behind the scenes, using intermediaries and proxies to carry out his orders while keeping his own hands clean. In the midst of this growing pressure, Luciano faced another form of internal betrayal, his eventual arrest. While he had managed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement for many years, it was clear that the inevitable was approaching. His arrest in 1936, on charges of operating a massive prostitution ring, marked a significant turning point in his career. The fact that it was a relatively minor charge, compared to the vast criminal empire he had built, underscored the desperation of the authorities to bring him down. Luciano's arrest was a victory for law enforcement, but it was also a moment of reflection for Luciano himself. For the first time in years, he was forced to confront the reality of his position. He was not invincible, and his empire could be threatened by the same forces he had so skillfully manipulated for so long. Yet even in the face of arrest, Luciano's resilience remained unshaken. He quickly began to work behind the scenes to orchestrate his own survival. His conviction and subsequent sentence to 30 to 50 years in prison marked the beginning of a new phase in his career. Despite being behind bars, Luciano continued to control his operations from within the prison walls. His ability to maintain his grip on power, even while incarcerated, was a testament to his genius as a strategist and leader. Throughout these turbulent years, Luciano's empire was tested in ways that few could have predicted. Rivalries, betrayals, law enforcement crackdowns, and internal conflicts all threatened to bring down the carefully constructed system he had built. Yet, Luciano demonstrated again and again that his ability to adapt to changing circumstances, his resilience in the face of adversity, and his unparalleled strategic mind allowed him to weather these storms. His empire may have faced serious threats, but Luciano's ability to maneuver through these dangers only solidified his place as one of the most legendary figures in the history of organized crime. The external and internal conflicts he faced during this period were not just tests of his power, they were a reflection of the brutal realities of the Mafia world, where survival was the ultimate measure of success. When Luciano was finally arrested in 1936, it was more than just the fall of a crime boss, it was the beginning of a new chapter in the life of a man who had long been regarded as untouchable. The arrest, which was a result of a long-standing investigation into his criminal empire, would be the first of many struggles he faced as the authorities and his rivals sought to dismantle what he had built. Yet, in true Luciano fashion, the arrest was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a new kind of battle, the struggle for survival behind bars. Luciano's arrest came after years of operating with relative impunity, shielded by his network of influence and his genius for staying one step ahead of law enforcement. However, the increasing attention from federal authorities had created a storm that was impossible to outrun. His most significant charge, running an enormous prostitution ring, was emblematic of the way Luciano's criminal activities had outgrown the more traditional mafia activities like bootlegging and gambling. As the U.S. government's crackdown on organized crime intensified, Luciano's world came crashing down. His arrest was a massive victory for law enforcement, but what they didn't anticipate was just how resilient Luciano would prove to be, even from within the confines of a prison cell. Luciano's conviction came quickly. Sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, It seemed like the end of the road for the once mighty boss. His imprisonment marked a dramatic shift in the power structure of the Mafia. For many, Luciano had been the embodiment of the American Mafia's golden age, the mastermind behind its organization and expansion. His empire spanned not just the streets of New York but international networks that brought in vast amounts of revenue from gambling, narcotics, and labor racketeering. In his absence, many expected his empire to fracture, and for rival factions to move in and claim parts of the territory Luciano had once controlled. However, what the authorities failed to understand, and what his rivals underestimated, was that Luciano had created something more enduring than just a criminal network. He had built a system, one that could survive even without him physically present. This was the first sign that even though Luciano was behind bars, his influence was far from extinguished. It became apparent that his ability to control the Mafia and its activities extended beyond his personal presence. Luciano's control was rooted in his vision, his strategic thinking, and his extensive network of loyal followers who were still active, both in New York and in his various other operations. From his prison cell, Luciano continued to exert control over the day-to-day operations of his empire. He was a master at keeping his hands clean, relying on intermediaries to carry out his commands. His network of trusted lieutenants, including figures like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, ensured that his criminal enterprises continued to run smoothly. They managed the complex web of operations that Luciano had set up, including his interests in gambling, narcotics, and labor unions, while Luciano remained the central figure in the organization's power structure. Despite the success of his empire's survival, Luciano faced a constant battle in prison. His status as a high-profile inmate drew attention, and his enemies within the criminal world saw his imprisonment as an opportunity to weaken his influence. The prison system was not kind to figures like Luciano. He faced constant threats from those who sought to capitalize on his vulnerability. Rival mobsters, perhaps seeing his incarceration as the beginning of the end, tried to undermine his authority even while he was behind bars. The very system he had helped build was now testing its limits, as those within his ranks struggled to assert control over various territories and operations. However, Luciano's ability to navigate these internal challenges was unparalleled. He had always excelled at managing complex relationships, and even from behind bars he maintained the loyalty of his men. His prison cell, rather than isolating him, became a hub of activity, a base from which he could still operate. His reputation, carefully cultivated over the years, provided him with the leverage needed to keep his empire intact. The Mafia under Luciano had never been just about violent enforcement. It had been about diplomacy, negotiation, and a shared understanding of the benefits of collaboration. His ability to manage his criminal empire through his subordinates, even from a prison cell, was a testament to his genius as a leader. But Luciano's time behind bars was not only about maintaining control over his operations, it was also a time of reflection and strategic thinking. While in prison, he had the space and the solitude to think about his future, and the future of the Mafia. He knew that his empire, while strong, would not be immune to change. The world of organized crime was constantly evolving, and Luciano was keenly aware that he would need to adapt if he was to maintain his grip on power. He spent his time in prison thinking about the long-term future of his operations, considering ways to diversify and expand, while also keeping his enemies at bay. In many ways, the period of imprisonment marked a shift in Luciano's approach to his criminal empire. It was no longer just about the day-to-day activities or the immediate profits. It was about positioning himself for the future. One of the most notable aspects of Luciano's time in prison was his relationship with the U.S. government. Despite his criminal activities, Luciano was still a valuable figure in the eyes of certain political and law enforcement officials. The government had a complicated relationship with Luciano. On one hand, he was a notorious criminal who had built a vast network of illicit operations, but on the other hand, his connections to politicians, law enforcement, and even some aspects of legitimate business made him a figure of interest. During his time in prison, Luciano's name became synonymous with power and influence, and even some government officials recognized the potential for leveraging that influence to their advantage. The turning point in Luciano's imprisonment came in 1946, when the U.S. government made a surprising decision. They chose to deport him to Italy. This move was partly a result of Luciano's ongoing criminal activities, but it was also a decision driven by the changing landscape of the Mafia. The government believed that by removing Luciano from the U.S., they could weaken his influence over the Mafia and make it harder for him to continue his operations. For Luciano, it was both a setback and an opportunity. Being deported to Italy meant that he would lose direct control over his operations in the United States, but it also gave him the freedom to operate on a global scale. He saw this as an opportunity to expand his empire beyond the confines of New York and the U.S. And he wasted no time in reaching out to old contacts in Italy and Europe. Luciano's deportation marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. In Italy, he found a different kind of power, a power rooted not just in criminal enterprises, but in the world of international smuggling, narcotics, and even political influence. Luciano's ties to European crime syndicates, particularly in Italy, allowed him to create new opportunities for his operations. Despite being far from the center of his empire, Luciano's strategic thinking and ability to leverage his international connections allowed him to continue to thrive in the criminal world. The man who had once dominated the streets of New York was now operating on a global scale, using his networks and connections to extend his reach across continents. Luciano's exile to Italy also gave him the freedom to reflect on his legacy. He had spent his entire career building an empire, but now, at the age of 56, he began to contemplate the long-term impact of his actions. Luciano understood the importance of legacy, both in terms of his criminal operations and his personal reputation. His time in Italy allowed him to reconcile the differences between the ruthless, violent persona he had built in the U.S. and the man he had become in exile, reflective, strategic, and focused on maintaining his influence without the need for constant violence. He had always understood that the key to lasting power was adaptability, and in Italy he would prove that he could still be a force to be reckoned with, even from the periphery of his old empire. Luciano's time in prison and eventual exile was a testament to his resilience and his ability to adapt to even the most difficult circumstances. The man who had once seemed untouchable had been brought low by the government's crackdown, but he had managed to rebuild his empire from within the walls of a prison and eventually from abroad. His story is one of survival, of leveraging relationships, and of maintaining control through intellect and strategy. The forces that once seemed to have destroyed him only made him more resourceful, more determined to hold on to his place at the top of the criminal world. And while his exile marked the end of one chapter, it was far from the end of his story. Luciano's trial was nothing short of a spectacle, a public display that illustrated the growing war between the Mafia and the law. As his criminal empire had expanded, so too had the scrutiny from the authorities. By the time he was arrested in 1936, he was already a marked man, the figurehead of the most powerful and dangerous crime syndicate in America. His trial was destined to capture the public's attention, not just because of the vast network of illicit enterprises he had orchestrated, but because of the man himself. A man who had been untouchable for so long, now finding himself at the mercy of the judicial system he had so skillfully navigated and manipulated. The courtroom drama that ensued during Luciano's trial was one of the most significant moments in the history of organized crime. For the authorities, this was a chance to bring down the kingpin of the American Mafia, the architect behind the syndicate's explosive growth during Prohibition and beyond. For Luciano, it was a moment of reckoning, a challenge to his long-held belief that the Mafia could operate above the law, and that those in power could remain untouchable. The case against Luciano was based on the charge of running a massive prostitution ring. It was an ironic twist of fate that it was this particular charge, one often seen as a lower-level crime in the world of organized crime, that would bring him to trial. In many ways, it underscored how far Luciano had come from the early days of his criminal career. In the past, he had been associated with smuggling, gambling, and bootlegging high-profile and lucrative enterprises. But by the 1930s, Luciano had broadened his reach, expanding into various areas of organized crime. The government's decision to focus on the prostitution racket was a practical one. It was something tangible, something they could prove in court. And it was just one piece of the vast criminal network that Luciano had carefully cultivated over the years. The trial itself was filled with drama, both inside and outside the courtroom. The prosecution was determined to make an example of Luciano, to demonstrate that even the most powerful figures in organized crime were not beyond the reach of the law. The media coverage was intense, with every development in the case being broadcast for public consumption. Luciano was no longer the shadowy figure operating behind the scenes, he was now a public figure, a criminal on trial, and his every move was scrutinized by the press and the public alike. Luciano, ever the master manipulator, was fully aware of the public spectacle his trial had become. He was no stranger to playing to an audience, and in many ways he used the trial to reinforce his image as the quintessential crime boss. Even in the courtroom he remained calm and composed, projecting the image of a man who was in control, even in the face of the legal system that sought to take him down. Luciano knew that his appearance in court would shape the public's perception of him, and he used this to his advantage. He refused to show fear or weakness, choosing instead to adopt the stance of a man who was merely going through the motions of a process he could not control, but ultimately, one he believed he would emerge victorious from. Despite the efforts of his legal team to defend him, the case against Luciano was strong. The prosecution had built a compelling argument, with numerous witnesses ready to testify against him, and a wealth of evidence linking him to the operation. However, Luciano's defense team was not without its own tactics. His attorneys worked tirelessly to discredit the witnesses, challenging their credibility and attempting to cast doubt on the validity of the evidence. It became clear that this trial would be a battle not just over the facts of the case, but over the perception of Luciano himself. In the end, Luciano's conviction was not the result of any one dramatic moment in the trial. Rather, it was the culmination of years of work by law enforcement, who had spent years gathering evidence, infiltrating his operations, and building a case that could bring him down. The conviction itself was not a complete surprise, but it was a bitter blow to Luciano and his empire. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, a sentence that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life, or so it seemed at the time. While the trial marked the end of Luciano's freedom in the United States, it was not the end of his influence or power. The Mafia, under his leadership, had evolved into a well-oiled machine, and even with Luciano behind bars, the machinery continued to run. His connections to key players within the Mafia, such as Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and others, ensured that his empire remained intact, even as the public celebrated what appeared to be his downfall.